In the sprawling, often disquieting tapestry of modern history, some figures emerge not merely as individuals, but as horrifying symbols of a deeper societal sickness. Jeffrey Epstein was one such figure. His name is awound in the public consciousness, a name that evokes a visceral storm of emotions, disgust, rage, and a profound, aching sorrow. To utter it is to conjure images of unfathomable wealth and unspeakable cruelty, of glittering galas and shadowed bedrooms, of private jets soaring toward island prisons disguised as paradise. The spider's gilded web, Jeffrey Epstein and the betrayal of justice is not simply a recounting of a criminal's life. It is an emotional and unflinching journey into the heart of a darkness that festered in the open, shielded by the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. This is a story about the corrosive power of money when it becomes untethered from morality and accountability. It is a story of a man who, with seemingly no discernible origin for his immense fortune, managed to purchase not just luxury, but legitimacy. He bought access, weaving a web of influence so intricate and far-reaching that it ensnared presidents and princes, Nobel laureates and titans of industry. He was the enigmatic friend, the financial wizard, the generous host who offered a world without judgment, a playground for the powerful. But beneath this shimmering, gilded surface, a monstrous truth was taking root, the price of admission into his world for so many was a tacit agreement to look away. More than anything, however, this is a story about the betrayal of the vulnerable. It is a memorial to the girls, some still children, whose lives were irrevocably shattered. Their dreams were twisted into nightmares, their trust weaponized against them, their voices silenced by fear, shame, and a justice system that seemed to value a predator's connections more than a child's. Pain. We will step into their silent suffering, not to sensationalize their trauma, but to honor their courage and bear witness to the truth they fought so desperately to tell. Their pain is the emotional anchor of this narrative, the undeniable human cost of Epstein's depravity and the complicity that surrounded him. We will explore the calculated, predatory machine he and his associates built, a sophisticated network of recruitment and abuse that operated for decades with chilling efficiency. This book is an attempt to understand how such evil could flourish for so long, to confront the uncomfortable reality that Epstein was not an isolated monster, but the product of a system that enabled him, protected him, and ultimately failed. To stop him, it is a harrowing exploration of the ultimate betrayal, the failure of justice itself. Chapter 1: A Mysterious Beginning, Epstein's Early Life. The story of Jeffrey Epstein does not begin in a palace or a boardroom, but in the salt-sprayed, working-class landscape of 1950s Brooklyn, a world away from the unimaginable luxury he would later command. To understand the man, one must first try to grasp the boy, an endeavor shrouded in the same frustrating mist that would later obscure his finances and his crimes. He was born in 1953 and raised in the Seagate and Coney Island neighborhoods, communities defined by the rhythmic crash of Atlantic waves, against a shore lined with amusement parks and modest apartment buildings. It was a world of stickball in the streets, of hot dogs from Nathan's Famous, of a tangible, striving energy that pulsed through the families who called it home. His parents, Seymour and Pauline Epstein, were Parks Department employees, solidly middle-class figures who seemingly offered their two sons, Jeffrey and Mark, a stable and unremarkable upbringing. Yet, even here, in the supposed clarity of childhood, the seeds of enigma were planted. Neighbors and old acquaintances would later paint a portrait of a different boy. He wasn't just bright, there was a peculiar intensity to him. While other children were lost in the chaotic joy of youth, Jeffrey was often described as being preternaturally focused, almost unnervingly so. He possessed a prodigious talent for mathematics, a language of logic and order that seemed to provide a framework for a mind that was already operating on a different plane. This gift was his first key, the first tool he would use to pry open doors that were supposed to be closed to a boy from his background. This was not the simple brilliance of an academic prodigy. It was coupled with a burgeoning, almost predatory charisma. He was a talker, a persuader, a boy who could command the attention of adults with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. There was an early understanding of leverage, of how to use his intellect not just to solve problems on a page, but to manipulate situations and people to his advantage. He skipped to grades at Lafayette High School, a testament to an intellect that could not be contained by a conventional pace. But this acceleration also served to further isolate him, placing a teenager among older peers, forcing him to adapt and learn to navigate social structures where he was always, in some way, an outsider looking in. This feeling of being separate, of being intellectually superior yet socially askew, would become a defining characteristic of his life. The emotional landscape of his home life remains a subject of speculation, a private realm guarded by the family's silence. What anxieties, what ambitions, what pains or triumphs unfolded within the walls of their apartment? Did the striving energy of post-war Brooklyn instill in him a desperate hunger for more, a deep-seated resentment of his modest beginnings, or was there something else, a colder, more detached element at his core from the very beginning? His younger brother, Mark, seemed to follow a more conventional path, eventually finding a place in his brother's opaque world, but always in his shadow. The relationship between them, like so much else, is a closed book. After high school, Jeffrey's path continued its accelerated, unconventional trajectory. He attended the prestigious Cooper Union, a full scholarship institution for the gifted, but he left before graduating. He then enrolled at New York University's Current Institute of Mathematical Sciences, a hub of elite intellectual activity, but again, he departed without a degree. This pattern is telling. It speaks to a mind that was brilliant enough to gain entry into exclusive institutions, but was perhaps too restless, too arrogant, or too uninterested in following a prescribed path to see it through. He didn't need the validation of a diploma. His validation came from outsmarting the system, from proving he could master the material without submitting to the structure. It was the first glimpse of a man who would live his life by his own set of rules, a man who believed his intellect and was sufficient to bend reality to his liking. The mysterious beginnings of Jeffrey Epstein are not found in dramatic trauma or overt tragedy, but in the unsettling quiet of a brilliant mind detaching itself from the common bonds of human experience, learning to see people and institutions not as communities to belong to, but as systems to be exploited. The boy from Coney Island was already gone, replaced by an enigma of his own creation, looking out at the world and calculating his next move. Chapter 2, From Classroom to Wall Street, An Unlikely Rise. The transition from the world of theoretical mathematics to the cloistered halls of one of New York City's most elite private schools is not a common career path for Jeffrey Epstein. It was a calculated leap, a strategic move that felt less like a passion for pedagogy and more like the infiltration of an ecosystem teeming with the power and wealth he craved. In the mid-1970s, armed with his formidable intellect but lacking a college degree, Epstein landed a job teaching physics and mathematics at the Dalton School on the Upper East Side. The very air at Dalton was different. It was rarefied, scented, with old money and new ambition. The students were the children of titans, the sons and daughters of CEOs, financiers, and cultural icons. For Epstein, this was not just a classroom, it was an observatory. He was, by all accounts, a magnetic and unorthodox teacher. He issued a rigid curriculum favoring a dynamic, almost Socratic method that both challenged and charmed his precocious students. He treated them less like children and more like intellectual peers, a tactic that was intoxicating to teenagers accustomed to a more traditional hierarchy. He was the cool teacher, the one who spoke their language, who understood their world, and who seemed to possess a wisdom that went beyond textbooks. But beneath the charismatic exterior, a more unsettling pattern was emerging. There was a discomforting familiarity in his interactions, particularly with his female students. He blurred the lines between mentor and friend, cultivating a deeply inappropriate intimacy, a grooming process cloaked in the guise of intellectual mentorship. The adoration he fostered was not just for the subject he taught, but for himself. He was building a cult of personality in miniature, testing the limits of his influence on a captive, Impressionable audience. It was within this privileged environment that Epstein made the pivotal connection that would catapult him from the classroom to the trading floor. The father of one of his students was Alan Ace Greenberg, the formidable chairman of the investment bank Bear Stearns, a legendary figure on Wall Street known for his sharp instincts and gruff demeanor. Epstein, with his characteristic audacity, cultivated a relationship with the family. He impressed Greenberg not with a resume, but with his raw intelligence, his quick grasp of complex financial concepts, and an unshakable self-confidence that was both startling and intriguing. Greenberg saw something in the young, degree-less teacher a flicker of the same predatory instinct, the same PSD poor, smart, and a deep desire to get rich that he famously looked for in his traders. The story of his hiring at Bear Stearns in 1976 has become legend, a testament to his powers of persuasion. He walked into one of the most aggressive and competitive firms on Wall Street, with no financial background, no degree, nothing but his mind and the potent endorsement of its chairman. It was an act of breathtaking audacity. He was an anomaly, an outsider who had bypassed every conventional checkpoint. This immediately set him apart, fostering both resentment from his colleagues and a deepening sense of his own exceptionalism. He didn't have to play by the same rules as everyone else because, from his very first day, he never had. His rise within the firm was nothing short of meteoric. He quickly mastered the arcane world of options trading and convertible arbitrage. He was not just a number cruncher, he was a financial artist, seeing patterns and opportunities that others missed. But his true genius lay not in the trades themselves, but in his unparalleled ability to manage people. He understood that Wall Street was, at its core, an emotional ecosystem driven by fear and greed. He played on these emotions with surgical precision. He cultivated the powerful, making himself indispensable to the firm's biggest clients and top partners. He became a limited partner in just 4 years, a remarkably swift ascent that solidified his status as a rising star. Yet, even as he soared, whispers of impropriety followed him. There were rumors of cutting corners, of pushing ethical boundaries, of a style that was too aggressive even for the bare-knuckle culture of Bear Stearns. In 1981, he left the firm abruptly. The official reasons remain murky: a dispute over compensation, a desire to start his own venture, but the departure felt like another chapter in his book of mysteries, another instance of Epstein operating within a system just long enough to extract what he needed before moving on, leaving unanswered questions in his wake. He had used Dalton to get to Wall Street, and now he would use Wall Street as a launchpad for something far grander and more terrifyingly private. The unlikely rise was complete. The creation of a shadow empire was about to begin. Chapter 3: The Making of a Power Broker, Leaving the Structured, albeit Cutthroat World of Bear Stearns was not a retreat for Jeffrey Epstein. It was a declaration of independence. The year 1980 to mark the birth of his own enigmatic firm, J. Epstein & Co. This was not a company in the traditional sense. It had no gleaming skyscraper office, no bustling trading floor, no public face. It was a boutique, intensely private, and deliberately opaque entity that existed primarily as a reflection of its founder. This was the moment Epstein transitioned from being a brilliant player in someone else's game to becoming the architect of his own universe, a universe governed by a single, unwavering principle: absolute discretion for the impossibly rich. The firm's stated purpose was money management, but only for a very specific clientele: billionaires. Epstein famously claimed he would not accept clients with less than $1 billion in assets. This audacious, almost absurdly exclusionary policy was a stroke of marketing genius. It created an aura of unparalleled exclusivity. To be an Epstein client was to be anointed, to be welcomed into the most rarefied financial club on the planet. It was a signal to the world that you had transcended mere wealth and entered the stratosphere of the financial elite. This exclusivity was his moat, protecting him from scrutiny. By dealing only with a handful of the world's wealthiest individuals, He ensured that his operations remained outside the purview of typical financial regulators and the prying eyes of the press. His clients were not just clients, they were his shield. The most critical relationship he forged in this era was with Leslie Wexner, the brilliant but press-shy billionaire founder of L Brands, the retail empire that included Victoria's Secret and The Limited. The bond between the two men remains one of the most profound mysteries of the Epstein saga. On the surface, they were a study in contrasts. Wexner, the Midwestern retail magnate who built a tangible empire of brick-and-mortar stores, and Epstein, the shadowy financier from Brooklyn who dealt in the abstract world of high finance. Yet, something clicked. Epstein became more than just Wexner's financial advisor. He became his confidant, his right-hand man, the keeper of his secrets, and the manager of his vast fortune. This relationship was the bedrock upon which Epstein built his empire of influence. Wexner granted Epstein a sweeping and extraordinary power of attorney, giving him complete control over his financial and personal affairs. It was a level of trust that is almost unheard of in the world of high finance, a total abdication of oversight that effectively handed Epstein the keys to a kingdom. Suddenly, Epstein wasn't just managing money, he was directing a multi-billion-dollar fortune. He bought planes, mansions, and artwork, all in the name of the Wexner Family Trust. The magnificent Manhattan townhouse on East 71st Street, which would become Epstein's opulent lair, was purchased by Wexner and later transferred to Epstein for a pittance. The private 727 jet that would later become infamous as the Lolita Express was part of the L Brands corporate fleet before being transferred to his control. With Wexner's fortune as his engine, Epstein's persona as a financial guru solidified. He was no longer just a money manager, he was a power broker. He used his position as Wexner's consigliere to project an image of immense personal wealth and financial acumen. He was a master of deflection and ambiguity. When asked about the source of his money, he would offer vague, impressive-sounding answers about currency trading, risk arbitrage, or recovering stolen fortunes for governments. The truth was likely far more prosaic and far more parasitic. He was living off the largesse of his one monumentally wealthy client. But the illusion was everything. This perceived financial independence gave him the standing to move in other circles of power. He wasn't seen as an employee or a subordinate, but as a peer. The making of the power broker was an elaborate, emotionally manipulated performance. He sold the world's most powerful people a fantasy that he was one of them, a self-made genius, who held the secret keys to the universe of money. And for a tragically long time, they believed him. Chapter 4, Money Without Explanation, The Fortune Question. The entire edifice of Jeffrey Epstein's life, the private islands, the fleet of aircraft, the sprawling mansions, the access to the global elite was built upon a foundation of sand, a fortune without a credible origin story. The question of his money is not a mere financial curiosity, it is the central, haunting mystery that enabled a generation of abuse. It was his financial opacity that granted him power, that shrouded him in an aura of untouchable genius, and that left investigators and journalists grasping at shadows for decades. To chase the source of Epstein's wealth is to enter a labyrinth of whispers, lies, and calculated misdirection, a journey that leaves one feeling a profound sense of outrage at how such a colossal question could go unanswered for so long. When pressed, Epstein himself was a master of the artful dodge. He would weave fantastical tales tailored to his audience. To some, he was a maverick currency trader, a lone wolf who made spectacular bets against volatile markets. To others, he was a discreet financial bounty hunter, recovering billions in stolen assets for foreign governments or wronged corporations, taking a hefty percentage as his fee. He even styled himself as a tax advisor to the super-rich, a wizard who could make their financial problems disappear. These stories were intoxicating because they played into the myth he so carefully cultivated, that of a singular genius operating on a plane far beyond ordinary comprehension. They were designed to stop further questions, to suggest that the mechanics of his wealth were simply too complex for a normal person to grasp. the most plausible and yet deeply unsettling explanation lies with his relationship with Leslie Wexner. As Wexner's sole financial manager for a significant period, Epstein had almost unlimited control over a retail fortune worth billions. The power of attorney Wexner granted him was a blank check, not just to manage assets but to direct, spend, and acquire. Experts who have examined the relationship suggest a spectrum of possibilities. At one end, Epstein was simply paid extraordinarily well, receiving fees and commissions that, over many years, could have accumulated into a nine-figure fortune. At the other, more sinister end of the spectrum lies the possibility of outright theft or embezzlement on a monumental scale. Was he siphoning off funds, making Wexner's money his own through a series of complex and untraceable transactions? The fact that Wexner himself has claimed to be a victim, stating that Epstein misappropriated vast sums of money, lends heavy credence to this theory. The emotional weight of this is staggering. The idea that one of the world's most successful businessmen could be so thoroughly deceived, his trust so completely violated, is a chilling testament to Epstein's manipulative prowess. Yet, even the Wexner connection doesn't satisfy all the questions. The sheer scale of Epstein's expenditures, the cash he seemed to have on hand, and the international scope of his operations have led to darker, more speculative theories. The most pervasive of these is blackmail. Did Epstein use his properties, equipped with hidden cameras, to capture compromising material on his powerful guests? Was his black book of contacts not just an address book, but a ledger of leverage? This theory casts his entire social enterprise in a terrifying new light. The parties, the trips on his private jet, the invitations to his island, were they all just elaborate schemes to gather compromat on presidents, princes, and billionaires? If true, he wasn't a money manager at all. He was a spy master, and his real business was the trafficking of secrets. His fortune in this scenario would have been built on a foundation of silence and fear, paid out by powerful people desperate to keep their indiscretions from seeing the light of day. This theory, while difficult to prove, resonates with a deep, emotional truth about the dark underbelly of power and the lengths to which people will go to protect their reputations. The money, then, was not just a means to an end, it was a weapon and a shield born from the very darkness it was used to perpetuate. The unanswered question of his fortune remains a source of profound frustration, a symbol of a system that allowed a man to amass unimaginable resources without a single, verifiable explanation, enabling him to build a world where he was utterly without account. Chapter 5, entering the elite, billionaires, royals, and politicians. Jeffrey Epstein did not merely accumulate wealth, he curated people. His greatest and most diabolical project was the construction of a social network so dazzling, so packed with power and prestige, that its collective gleam would blind the world to the darkness at its center. He understood a fundamental, heartbreaking truth about society: legitimacy is a transferable property. By surrounding himself with the great and the good presidents, princes, Nobel laureates, and tech billionaires, he borrowed their credibility, draping it over himself like an ermine robe. To see him with them was to believe he belonged among them. This chapter of his life is a deeply emotional journey into the seductive power of access and the chilling moral compromises made by those who flew too close to his sun. His New York townhouse and his Palm Beach mansion were not homes. They were stages, meticulously designed sets for the grand performance of his life. The guest lists for his dinners were a work of art, a carefully balanced ecosystem of power. One night, you might find a former US president seated next to a Hollywood icon across from a groundbreaking scientist. The conversation, guided by Epstein, would be brilliant, eclectic, and intoxicating. He positioned himself not as a host, but as a convener, a modern-day Medici creating a salon for the world's most interesting minds. For those invited, it was an irresistible law. It was a chance to network at the highest possible level, too. Feel the electric thrill of being in the room where it happens. This was the nectar he offered, and so many drank from it without questioning what poison might be mixed in. The two most prominent political figures in his orbit were Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. men who represented different poles of American power but who were both drawn to Epstein's magnetic field. Trump, in a 2000 magazine interview, famously called him a terrific guy who was a lot of fun to be with, remarking on his affinity for beautiful women, a comment that now lands with a sickening thud. Clinton was a far more frequent flyer. Flight logs show the former president took numerous trips on Epstein's private 727, the Lolita Express, for philanthropic missions in Africa and other destinations. The image of a beloved former president, a global humanitarian, smiling alongside a man who was secretly a monstrous predator, is a source of deep public anguish and betrayal. It raises agonizing questions about what was known or what was willfully ignored in the pursuit of convenience and camaraderie. Perhaps the most catastrophic of these elite relationships was with Prince Andrew, the Duke of York. The bond between the Queen of England's second son and the mysterious American financier was one of genuine friendship filled with lavish holidays, private jet flights, and access to the highest echelons of the British aristocracy. The photograph of the prince with his arm wrapped around the waist of a 17-year-old Virginia Giuffre, with Ghislaine Maxwell smirking in the background, is an image of almost unbearable damnation. It is a visual confirmation of the collision of worlds, the ancient, fairy tale institution of royalty and the sordid, criminal underworld of sexual abuse. The prince's subsequent, disastrous attempts to explain away the relationship only deepened the sense of public revulsion, revealing a shocking lack of empathy and a profound disconnect from the reality of the suffering Epstein caused. Beyond the headliners, the list stretched on. Titans of tech, giants of Wall Street, revered academics from Harvard and MIT all were, at one time or another, part of his constellation. He founded foundations and funded scientific research, using philanthropy as another tool to launder his reputation. He craved the intellectual validation of scientists as much as he craved the political legitimacy of presidents. Each association was another brick in the fortress of his credibility. Looking back at this glittering array of power brokers, one feels a wave of sorrow and anger. How could so many brilliant, powerful people fail to see the rot? Were they so blinded by his wealth, so seduced by his charm, so captivated by the access he provided that they suspended their judgment? The story of Epstein's elite circle is a heartbreaking parable about willful blindness, a devastating portrait of a world so insulated by privilege that the cries of the vulnerable could not penetrate its walls. Chapter 6: Private Islands and Hidden Worlds. To truly comprehend the depth of Jeffrey Epstein's depravity, one must journey to the private realms he created, worlds built with his mysterious fortune and designed for the singular purpose of control. These were not simply homes, they were kingdoms carved out of the landscape, isolated from the laws of society and morality. The Zorro Ranch in New Mexico and, most infamously, Little St. James in the U.S. Virgin Islands were the physical manifestations of his predatory soul places of breathtaking beauty that concealed a soul-crushing ugliness. To imagine them is to feel a creeping sense of dread, a claustrophobic horror that clings to the very air of these corrupted paradises. The Zorro Ranch, a sprawling 33,000 square foot estate set amidst the stark, majestic beauty of the New Mexico desert, was a fortress of solitude and secrecy. Its remote location, miles from the nearest town, was its primary defense. Here, under the vast, indifferent sky, Epstein constructed a world entirely of his own making. The main residence was an opulent palace in the desert, but the true nature of the place was hinted at in its other structures, including a private airstrip capable of landing his jets. Far from the prying eyes of public airports, he spoke of wanting to use the ranch for a bizarre eugenics project, a plan to seed the human race with his DNA. The idea is so grotesquely narcissistic, so chillingly devoid of humanity, that it provides a stark window into his psyche. He did not see other people as equals, he saw them as material for his grandiose, monstrous ambitions. The ranch was his laboratory, a place where his darkest fantasies could be entertained, far from the judgment of the outside world. But it is the island of Little St. James that has become the enduring symbol of his evil. Purchased in 1998, this 72-acre slice of Caribbean paradise was transformed into his personal fiefdom. From the air, it looked like heaven, turquoise waters, pristine, white sand beaches, lush green hills dotted with palm trees. But on the ground, a sinister architecture took shape. There was the main villa, a sprawling complex for entertaining his powerful guests. And then there was the bizarre, blue and white striped structure with a golden dome, a building that looked like a temple but whose purpose remains a subject of horrifying speculation. Was it a music room, as he claimed, or something else? Its windowless design and strange acoustics created a sense of disorientation, a place designed to unsettle and control. The emotional weight of the island is almost unbearable. One can almost feel the chilling juxtaposition of staggering natural beauty and sickening human cruelty. Imagine being a young, vulnerable girl, flown to this place of impossible beauty, thinking you are stepping into a dream. The sun is warm, the seas are dazzling blue, but soon the dream curdles into a nightmare. The isolation, once beautiful, becomes terrifying. There is no escape. The island is not a sanctuary, it is a cage. The sound of the waves is not soothing. It is a constant reminder that you are trapped, miles from home, completely at the mercy of the man who owns the very ground beneath your feet. Every path, every building, every carefully manicured garden feels tainted by the suffering that took place there. The island, which he nicknamed Little St. Jeff's, was the ultimate expression of his power. Here, he was not just a billionaire, he was a king, a god in his own dominion, where he made the rules and where the screams of his victims were swallowed by the vast, indifferent ocean. These private worlds were not escapes from reality, they were meticulously crafted realities of his own, designed to facilitate, conceal, and perpetuate his crimes on an industrial scale. Chapter 7: Young Victims and Silent Suffering. This is the heart of the story. Beyond the money, the power, and the intrigue, there is a core of immense and enduring human pain. This chapter is a sacred space, a memorial to the girls and young women whose lives were stolen and irrevocably broken by Jeffrey Epstein and his network. To approach their stories requires a deep breath and a commitment to bearing witness, not with a lurid curiosity, but with a profound and aching empathy. Theirs is not a single story, but a chorus of suffering, a harmony of stolen innocence that echoes across decades. The emotional landscape here is one of desolate sorrow, of a grief so profound it feels bottomless, mixed with a white-hot rage at the injustice they endured in silence. For so long, the victims were so often girls on the precipice of life, full of dreams and vulnerabilities. They came from broken homes, from families struggling with poverty, from situations where the promise of a few $100s felt like a lifeline. They were found in schools, in trailer parks, on the streets of Palm Beach. They were not seeking a predator, they were seeking an opportunity. They were told it was a job, a chance to be a mouse for a wealthy, eccentric man. The initial proposition was always so deceptively simple, so benign. It was just a massage. Then came the violation. The moment the door closed, the friendly, powerful man turned into something else entirely. We must try to imagine the terror, the confusion, the tidal wave of shame that crashed over them. They were children, some as young as 14. Their bodies were not their own. Their sense of self was shattered. In that room, a profound and violent theft occurred, not just of their physical autonomy, but of their trust in the world, in adults, in the very concept of safety. Epstein was a master of psychological manipulation. He would follow the abuse with a chilling performance of normalcy, handing them cash, speaking to them as if nothing untoward had happened. This was a form of gaslighting at its most cruel, designed to make them question their own reality. Was this normal in the world of the rich? Was this their fault? The suffering did not end when they left the room. It metastasized, growing into a cancer that infected every part of their lives. They carried the secret like a lead weight in their stomachs. Shame became their constant companion, a whispering voice telling them they were dirty, they were worthless, they were complicit. The money they received felt like poison, a tangible symbol of their own violation. Many dropped out of school. They fell into depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. They struggled with substance abuse, eating disorders, and self-harm, desperate for any way to numb the agony or punish the body they felt had betrayed them. Their relationships crumbled. How could they trust anyone again? How could they experience intimacy without the terrifying echo of their trauma? They felt isolated, marked, living in a world that seemed to be moving on while they were trapped in an endless loop of pain. For decades, their suffering was silent. They were afraid to speak out, terrified of Epstein's power, his wealth, his connections. They were told no one would believe them. They were girls from the wrong side of the tracks, and he was a friend to presidents and princes. Who would the world listen to? The torment of this silence, of knowing their abuser was being celebrated, lauded, and photographed with the most powerful people on earth, is a unique and gut-wrenching form of torture. Their silent suffering is the truest measure of Epstein's monstrosity, a deafening scream that the world chose for far too long not to hear. Chapter 8: The Recruitment Web: How Abuse Was Sustained. The horrifying scope of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes cannot be understood as the actions of a lone predator. To believe that would be to underestimate the chilling sophistication of his evil. His abuse was not a series of random, opportunistic acts. It was a system, a business, a meticulously designed and ruthlessly efficient trafficking operation. To dissect this machinery is to feel a cold, sickening fury at the calculated cruelty of it all. This was not a crime of passion, it was a cold, corporate enterprise whose product was the suffering of children. At the center of this web, orchestrating its daily operations, with a terrifying blend of social grace and moral depravity, was Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell, the daughter of the disgraced media tycoon Robert Maxwell, provided Epstein with something his money alone could not buy: social pedigree and a female face. With a polished British accent, her impeccable connections, and her status as a high society insider, she was the perfect tool for disarming both potential victims and the powerful figures in their orbit. She was the friendly, reassuring presence, the cool older sister figure who could bridge the gap between Epstein's predatory world and the everyday lives of young girls. Her involvement was not peripheral, it was foundational. She was the chief recruiter, the den mother, the enforcer. The recruitment process was a masterclass in psychological grooming. Maxwell and other recruiters would target girls in vulnerable situations, approaching them in public places with a captivating smile and an irresistible offer. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the lifestyle she projected. She would take them shopping, treat them to meals, and talk to them about their dreams, all the while subtly weaving them into Epstein's orbit. She was selling a fantasy, and she was an incredibly effective salesperson. Her very presence served to normalize the abnormal. If this glamorous, well-connected woman was a part of it, how bad could it be? She was the Judas goat, leading the lambs to the slaughter with a gentle and trustworthy nudge. Once a girl was brought into the fold, she was often coerced into becoming a recruiter herself. This was the most insidious and heartbreaking aspect of the entire machine. Epstein and Maxwell turned victims into vectors of their own abuse. A girl would be instructed to find other girls, her friends, her classmates. They were paid a bonus for each new mass they brought in. This tactic served multiple purposes. It created a constant supply of new victims. It also enmeshed the girls deeper into the criminal enterprise, layering guilt upon their existing trauma and making it even harder for them to escape or speak out. They were now complicit, however unwillingly. This created a pyramid scheme of pain, a self-sustaining cycle of abuse where the violated were forced to violate others, perpetuating the very nightmare from which they could not wake. The entire operation was sustained by a culture of fear and control. The girls were monitored. They were threatened, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. Epstein's immense power was a constant, unspoken menace. He knew powerful people. He had endless money. Who would dare to cross him? The system was designed to isolate them, to make them feel utterly alone and powerless. The recruitment web was not just a network of people, it was a psychological prison. It was built on the calculated exploitation of youthful trust, economic desperation, and the powerful social lubricant of a smiling, female face. It demonstrates a level of organized depravity that is difficult to comprehend, a testament to the fact that Epstein's greatest and most terrible creation was not his fortune, but the human trafficking machine that it funded. Chapter 9 whispers ignored, early warnings, and missed chances. The air in Palm Beach in the late 1990s was thick with a unique blend of old money and new ambition, a heavy perfume of salt, gardenias, and entitlement. It was a town of manicured hedges and whispered secrets, where the lines between public prestige and private vice were drawn in disappearing ink. Along the sun-bleached expanse of South Ocean Boulevard, behind the towering ficus walls that shielded the estates of the ultra-wealthy, from the prying eyes of the world, a darkness was beginning to fester. It had a name, a face, and a seemingly endless supply of cash. Jeffrey Epstein. To the outside world, Epstein was an enigma, a Gatsby-like figure who had materialized from the cutthroat world of New York finance. He was the money manager to the Billionaires, a man whose own wealth seemed as vast as it was mysterious. His sprawling mansion at 358 El Brillo Way was a local landmark, its grandeur a testament to his success. But for a growing number of teenage girls from the less glamorous zip codes of Palm Beach County, that mansion was becoming a place of profound dread. The first whispers were tentative, fragile things, easily broken. They were the hushed confessions of a daughter to her mother, the tearful call to a friend, the gnawing anxiety of a girl who had been paid a few $100s just to give a massage to a man who made her skin crawl. These were not stories of conventional abuse that law enforcement was accustomed to. The narratives were confusing, coated in a veneer of legitimacy. The girls were often recruited by other girls, slightly older and more confident. They were told it was just a job, an easy way to make money. They would be driven to the mansion, its sheer scale designed to intimidate and impress. Inside, the atmosphere was a disorienting mix of opulence and sterility. Priceless art hung on the walls, but the rooms felt cold, impersonal. And then there was Epstein himself. He wasn't a cartoon villain, his evil was more insidious. He could be charming, inquisitive, almost professorial, speaking of mathematics and science. He presented the encounters not as sordid transactions, but as something mundane, almost therapeutic for him. This calculated normalcy was his most potent weapon. It disarmed them, made them question their own revulsion. Was this really wrong? He was so rich, so important. People like him didn't do bad things, did they? The first official reports to the Palm Beach Police Department were met with a confounding mix of skepticism and inaction. The complaints were often piecemeal, arriving without the full context of a coordinated pattern. A parent would call, alleging their daughter had been touched inappropriately at Epstein's home. The police might take a statement, perhaps even drive by the imposing mansion. But the investigations would inevitably stall. How could they build a case against a man of such stature, based on the wavering testimony of a troubled teenager? Epstein's name carried weight. He had powerful friends. He had notoriously aggressive lawyers. The path of least resistance was to file the report away, to treat it as an isolated, unprovable incident. One of the earliest and most heartbreaking missed chances came in the form of a family who refused to be silent. Their daughter, a minor, had been lured into Epstein's web. When she tearfully confessed the details of the abuse to her parents, they were horrified. They did what any parent would do. They went to the police. They were persistent, providing names, details, and a clear account of the sophisticated recruiting operation. They believed in the system, but the system did not believe in them. Their pleas seemed to vanish into a bureaucratic void. The case languished. The officer assigned to it seemed overwhelmed, perhaps even intimidated. The family felt a growing sense of despair, as if they were shouting into a void. They were watching a predator operate with impunity, and the one institution designed to stop him seemed paralyzed. This paralysis was a symptom of a larger disease. Epstein had masterfully insulated himself, He operated through intermediaries, women like Ghislaine Maxwell, whose social grace and British accent lent an air of sophistication to the grotesque enterprise. The payments to the girls were in cash, leaving no paper trail. The psychological manipulation was intense. He made them feel complicit, special and terrified all at once. He would tell them he had cameras everywhere, that he knew powerful people, that their lives could be ruined if they spoke out. For a vulnerable teenager from a low-income family, these were not idle threats. They were paralyzing truths. The whispers of his crimes were being actively suppressed, not just by his power, but by the shame and fear he expertly instilled in his victims. The chances to stop him were not just missed, they were ignored, fumbled, and swept under the rug, creating a vacuum of accountability where his darkness could grow, metastasize, and consume countless more lives for another decade to come. Chapter 10, The 2008 Deal, Justice Compromised. By 2007, the whispers from Palm Beach had finally crescendoed into a shout that could no longer be ignored. A sprawling federal investigation, backed by the damning testimony of dozens of young women, had painted a picture so vivid and horrifying that a lengthy prison sentence for Jeffrey Epstein seemed not just possible but inevitable. The 53-page federal indictment was ready, a meticulous catalogue of depravity detailing a vast sex trafficking conspiracy that spanned years and crossed state lines. For the survivors and their families who had endured years of fear, shame, and the crushing feeling of being ignored, it felt as if the gears of justice were finally, powerfully turning in their favor. They braced themselves for a trial, for the catharsis of seeing their abuser face them in a public court of law. What they got instead was a betrayal so cold and absolute it felt like a second assault. It arrived not with the bang of a gavel, but with the silent stroke of a pen in a deal shrouded in secrecy. The 2008 Non-Prosecution Agreement (NPA) was a document that would become a monument to the failure of the American justice system. It was a deal hammered out in the shadows, not between a humble defendant and righteous prosecutors, but between a phalanx of the country's most formidable defense attorneys, and a U.S. Attorney's Office that seemed eager to make the entire problem disappear. The architect of this compromise from the government's side was Alexander Acosta, then the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, faced with Epstein's legal dream team, a roster that included Kenneth Starr, Alan Dershowitz, and former FBI Director Louis Freeh's firm. Acosta's office folded. The reasoning offered later was a tapestry of excuses. The victims were supposedly weak witnesses, a trial would be traumatic for them, a conviction was not a certainty. But to the women who had been assured they would have their day in court, these justifications rang hollow, sounding less like legal strategy and more like capitulation to the sheer force of Epstein's power and influence. The terms of the deal were sickeningly lenient. Epstein would plead guilty to 2 state-level prostitution charges, one involving a minor. The sweeping federal indictment, the one that carried the threat of a life sentence for sex trafficking, would be completely sealed and abandoned. He would serve a mere 13 months in a county jail, not a federal prison. And even this token punishment was a farce. He was granted an unprecedented work release program, allowing him to leave the jail for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, to work from his lavish downtown office. It was less a sentence than an inconvenience, a brief, state-sanctioned interruption to his life of luxury. But the most insidious part of the NPA was its scope. The agreement granted federal immunity not only to Epstein himself, but to the named co-conspirators and, most shockingly, to any potential co-conspirators. It was a blanket pardon for a ghost network of enablers, recruiters, and participants whose names were known only to Epstein and the federal prosecutors, who had just promised never to pursue them. It was a legal shield of breathtaking breadth, effectively shutting down any future federal investigation into the full extent of his criminal enterprise. The emotional impact on the survivors was catastrophic. They learned of the deal not from the prosecutors who were supposed to be their advocates, but through media reports. The sense of whiplash was violent, from the cusp of vindication to the abyss of betrayal. Attorney Bradley Edwards, who represented Many of the victims fought frantically against the secrecy, arguing that his client's rights under the Crime Victims' Rights Act had been grossly violated by being excluded from the plea negotiations. The courts, however, initially sided with the government, reinforcing the chilling message that in this case, the victims simply did not matter. Their pain, their trauma, and their right to justice were deemed expendable commodities traded away for a quick and quiet resolution that protected a powerful man and his even more powerful friends. The 2008 deal was more than a legal document, it was a moral stain. It was the moment the system looked at the scales of justice, saw a pile of money and influence on one side, and the broken lives of young girls on the other, and chose the money. It was a compromise that guaranteed the whispers would continue, that Epstein would walk free, and that true justice would be delayed for another agonizing decade. Chapter 11, Protected by Power, Influence over the Law. Jeffrey Epstein's greatest asset was not his mysterious fortune, it was his collection of people. He was a curator of influence, a connoisseur of power, and he wielded his connections with the precision of a surgeon. The legal system, designed to be an impartial arbiter of fact, proved to be just another institution susceptible to the intoxicating aura of his network. The 2008 non-prosecution agreement was not an anomaly. It was the culmination of a long-cultivated strategy. Epstein did not merely break the law. He enveloped himself in a shield woven from the threads of prestige, intellect, and political power, rendering himself almost untouchable. This shield was on full display in the assembly of his legal dream team. It was a roster designed, not just to argue the law, but to intimidate and overwhelm. There was Kenneth Starr, the former Whitewater independent counsel whose name was synonymous with relentless federal investigation. There was Alan Dershowitz, the famed Harvard law professor and civil libertarian, whose intellectual weight could bend legal theory. They were attorneys from a firm founded by a former FBI director. This was not a team hired simply to defend a client. It was a show of force, a clear signal to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami that any attempt to prosecute Epstein would result in a brutal, protracted, and politically messy war. They didn't just fight the case, they fought the system itself, challenging the prosecutors, appealing to their superiors in Washington, and creating an atmosphere of such high-stakes pressure that a quiet, compromised deal began to look like an attractive off-ramp for Alexander Acosta and his team. Beyond the courtroom, Epstein's power was more subtle but equally pervasive. His life was a performance of legitimacy. He surrounded himself with the brightest minds in science and academia, hosting lavish symposia at his private island and in the Virgin Islands, bankrolling research, and making significant donations to institutions like Harvard University. By associating with Nobel laureates and renowned physicists, he was laundering his reputation. He wasn't just a rich man, he was a philanthropist, a patron of science, a man of profound intellectual curiosity. Each photograph with a respected scientist, each fawning article about his intellectual salons, added another layer to his protective armor. It made the allegations against him seem preposterous. How could a man who debated the origins of the universe with Stephen Hawking be engaged in such sordid, base criminality? This cognitive dissonance was a powerful defense mechanism, making it harder for law enforcement, journalists, and the public to accept the horrifying truth. His political connections were a formidable fortress. He cultivated relationships across the political spectrum, from former President Bill Clinton, who flew on Epstein's private jet, the Lolita Express numerous times, to Donald Trump, who once called him a terrific guy. He welcomed Prince Andrew, a member of the British royal family, into his inner circle, securing a friendship that provided the ultimate veneer of establishment respectability. These were not casual acquaintances, they were symbiotic relationships. For the powerful, Epstein offered a world of unimaginable luxury, discretion, and access to other influential figures. In return, they gave him their most valuable commodity, their credibility. Their association served as an unspoken character reference, a silent testament to his standing. This influence cascaded down to the local level. In Palm Beach, Epstein was a known quantity, a donor, a powerful resident. The initial reluctance of the local police to aggressively pursue the early complaints can be seen through this lens. In a small town governed by wealth and power, launching a full-scale investigation into a man like Epstein was a fraught proposition. It was easier to believe he was eccentric, not criminal. Easier to accept the narrative he had so carefully constructed. His influence was not always a direct command, but a pervasive pressure, an unspoken understanding that this was a man who was not to be crossed. He had created a world where the normal rules did not seem to apply to him, and for over a decade, the legal system, dazzled and intimidated by the power he projected, tragically agreed. Chapter 12: Media Silence and Institutional Failure. The failure to stop Jeffrey Epstein was not solely a collapse of the justice system. It was a catastrophic failure of the gatekeepers of society, most notably the media, the Fourth Estate, the institution theoretically tasked with holding power to account and giving voice to the voiceless. Met the Epstein story with a decade of confounding silence, cowardice, and complicity. His story is a case study in how a determined predator with unlimited resources can manipulate and intimidate the press, ensuring his secrets remain buried in plain sight. The first attempts to expose Epstein were met with a legal firewall of terrifying efficiency in the mid-2000s, as reporters began to sniff around the edges of the Palm Beach allegations. They were not met with no comment. They were met with immediate, aggressive threats from Epstein's high-powered attorneys. The strategy was clear: to make the story so legally perilous, so expensive to pursue, that news organizations would simply back down. Journalists and their editors received letters threatening multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuits. They were accused of being part of extortion plots. Epstein's legal team would bury them in paperwork, demanding retractions for even the slightest inaccuracy, creating an atmosphere of fear. For many newsrooms, already facing budget cuts and shrinking resources, the financial risk of taking on a litigious billionaire was simply too great. The story was spiked, the reporters reassigned. This legal intimidation was compounded by a more insidious form of influence. Epstein actively courted journalists and media moguls. He would invite prominent columnists and editors to his dinner parties, dazzling them with his intellect and his access to other powerful people. He understood that proximity to power is a currency in media circles. By bringing journalists into his orbit, he transformed them from potential adversaries into acquaintances, making it socially and professionally awkward to then publish a story accusing him of being a child molester. He planted positive stories about his philanthropy and his intellectual pursuits, muddying the waters and building a public narrative that directly contradicted the dark rumors. He even allegedly tried to kill negative stories by offering scoops or exclusive access on other topics, a transactional form of journalism at its most corrupt. Vicky Ward, then a reporter for Vanity Fair, experienced this pressure firsthand. In the early 2000s, while profiling Epstein, she uncovered disturbing allegations from two sisters about his abuse. She fought to include their story, but after intense pressure from Epstein and a subsequent threat from his lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, the most damning material was excised from the final article by her editors. The story that was published painted him as a mysterious and powerful financier, effectively cementing the myth while burying the crime. It was a pivotal moment of institutional failure. One of the world's most prestigious magazines had the truth in its grasp and let it go. This media failure was mirrored in other institutions. Universities like Harvard accepted millions of dollars from Epstein, lending their sterling reputations to his name without performing even basic due diligence. The scientific community embraced him as a patron, turning a blind eye to the source of his wealth. These institutions, hungry for funding and prestige, performed a willing transaction. They took his money and in return, they gave him a cloak of legitimacy. Each donation, each professorship he funded, each symposium he hosted made the allegations against him seem that much more unbelievable. The collective result was a conspiracy of silence, an ecosystem where the truth could not survive. The lawyers scared the reporters befriended the subject, the editors buckled under pressure, and the esteemed institutions provided the cover. For the survivors, this silence was a constant, screaming torment. It told them that their pain was less important than a billionaire's reputation, that the institutions they were taught to trust were part of the machinery of their abuse. The silence wasn't just a lack of noise, it was an active force, a heavy blanket that smothered the truth and allowed a predator to operate in the open for years on end. Chapter 13, Survivors Speak, Voices Long Suppressed. For more than a decade, their stories were a scattered chorus of pain, dismissed as whispers, sealed by legal documents, and smothered by a conspiracy of silence. They were the ghosts in Jeffrey Epstein's gilded machine, their trauma the invisible fuel that powered his world. But the dam of silence, built of money, power, and fear, was never impermeable. It had cracks, and in 2018, thanks to the tenacious reporting of Julie K. Brown at the Miami Herald, those cracks finally shattered, unleashing a torrent of truth that would wash away the carefully constructed edifice of Epstein's impunity. The survivors, long suppressed, began to speak, not in whispers but in a collective roar of righteous fury. The Herald series, Perversion of Justice, was a masterclass in investigative journalism, but its true power lay in its profound empathy. Brown did what no one in a position of authority had bothered to do for years. She found the women. She listened to them and she believed them. The series centered on their experiences, transforming them from anonymous victims in a decade-old case file into living, breathing human beings with names, faces, and stories that demanded to be heard. Reading their accounts was like stepping into a waking nightmare. There was the story of Courtney Wild, who at 14 was lured to the Palm Beach mansion for a massage that became a horrifying sexual assault. Her voice, filled with the raw pain of a childhood stolen, resonated with a chilling clarity. She spoke of the confusion, the shame, and the utter powerlessness she felt in that opulent, cold house. She described the subsequent years of struggling with the trauma, the feeling of being discarded not only by her abuser but by the very justice system that was supposed to protect her. Her fight to unseal the records of the 2008 secret deal became a central pillar of the public's reawakening to the case. Her refusal to be silenced, her insistence on her rights as a victim, was an act of breathtaking courage. They were the voices of Virginia Giuffre, then Roberts, whose journey took her from a locker room attendant at Mar-a-Lago into the darkest corners of Epstein's international sex trafficking ring. Her detailed, harrowing accounts of being passed among Epstein's powerful friends, including Prince Andrew, were explosive. For years, she had been relentlessly attacked, branded a liar and an extortionist. Yet she persisted, her voice unwavering even in the face of global ridicule and intimidation. Her story laid bare the international scope of Epstein's operation and the chilling complicity of those within his orbit. And there were so many others. Each story added another layer to the portrait of manipulation and abuse. They spoke of the recruitment process, how they were targeted in their schools and communities, chosen for their youth and their vulnerability. They described Ghislaine Maxwell not as a peripheral figure, but as the chief architect of their entrapment, a woman who used her charm and social standing to act as a Judas goat, leading them to the slaughter. They spoke of the psychological games, the way Epstein would mix abuse with conversations about their homework or their future, a disorienting tactic designed to blur lines and foster dependence. They spoke of the cash handed to them after each encounter, a transaction that served to both silence and shame them, making them feel complicit in their own violation. Hearing these women speak, one after another, was to witness an act of profound reclamation. They were taking back the narrative that had been stolen from them, their voices filled with anguish but also with an unbreakable strength, exposed the human cost of the backroom deals and institutional failures. They were no longer statistics or inconvenient witnesses. They were daughters, sisters, and mothers, whose lives had been irrevocably scarred. Their collective testimony was a force of nature. It did more than just restart a cold case, it ignited a cultural firestorm forcing a society that had looked away for so long to finally stare into the abyss and acknowledge the faces of the children who had been thrown into it. Chapter 14. The 2019 Arrest. A Reckoning Begins. The evening of July 6, 2019 was humid and unremarkable at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, a bustling hub for the private jets of the world's elite. For Jeffrey Epstein, stepping off his Gulfstream G550 after a trip from Paris, it should have been just another seamless return to his American empire. But as he descended the stairs onto the tarmac, the familiar routine was shattered. Instead of a waiting limousine, he was met by a team of FBI agents and NYPD officers. The moment that his survivors, their lawyers, and a handful of journalists had fought for and dreamed of for over a decade had finally, shockingly, arrived. The untouchable man was being touched, his hands placed in cuffs, his life of impunity brought to an abrupt and public halt. The news of his arrest sent a seismic shockwave across the globe. It was a lead story on every news channel, the banner, headline on every website. For years, Epstein had existed as a shadowy figure, his crimes known only to a dedicated few who followed the case. Now, his face was everywhere, his name synonymous with a level of depravity that stunned the public. The indictment, unsealed by the Southern District of New York, was a brutal and damning document. It accused him of sex trafficking and conspiracy, detailing a litany of abuses against dozens of girls in New York and Florida. From 2002 to 2005, a period pointedly not covered by his sweetheart deal in Florida. For the survivors, the arrest was a moment of profound, complicated emotion. It was a surge of vindication, a public affirmation that they had been telling the truth all along. After years of being ignored, disbelieved, and maligned, the world was finally listening. The system that had so profoundly failed them in Florida seemed poised to finally deliver justice in New York. There was a palpable sense of hope, a feeling that this time would be different. This time, there would be no secret deals. This time, there would be a public trial where they could face him, speak their truth, and watch as the full weight of the law descended upon him. The legal battle began immediately and with ferocious intensity. In a packed Manhattan courtroom, federal prosecutors painted Epstein as a continuing danger to the community, a man who had left a trail of victims in his wake. They argued he was an extreme flight risk, possessing a private jet, vast offshore wealth, and even a fake Austrian passport with a different name and a photo of himself, discovered in a locked safe in his Manhattan townhouse. The image of this illicit passport became a potent symbol of his duplicity. A man who always had an escape plan, Epstein's new legal team fought back with equal vigor. They portrayed him as a changed man who had abided by the terms of his 2008 agreement. They offered a staggering bail package, initially proposing $100 million and later increasing it, coupled with home confinement in his $77 million mansion, monitored by 24/7 armed guards that he himself would pay for. The argument was a stunning display of the arrogance of wealth, that a private prison of his own making, a gilded cage, could substitute for an actual one. The bail hearing became a crucible of emotion. Prosecutors brought some of his accusers into the courtroom where they sat just feet away from the man who had haunted their lives. The judge, Richard Berman, ultimately denied bail, stating in a scathing ruling that no set of conditions could guarantee that Epstein wouldn't pose a danger to the community. The decision was a monumental victory for the prosecution and the survivors. It felt like the first solid step on a long road to a true reckoning, as Epstein was led away, trading his designer clothes for a prison jumpsuit at the notoriously grim Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC. It seemed the shield of power and money had finally been pierced. The reckoning, it appeared, had truly begun. Chapter 15. A Death in Custody, Questions Without Answers. The air in Lower Manhattan on the morning of August 10, 2019, was thick with the usual summer haze, but inside the walls of the Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC, a different kind. A fog was descending, one of confusion, shock, and a profound, sickening sense of anticlimax. Jeffrey Epstein, the most high-profile federal inmate in the country, The man at the center of a story that gripped the world was dead. He was found unresponsive in his cell in the special housing unit, the most secure part of the facility. The reckoning that had begun with his dramatic arrest just 1 month prior had ended not with a verdict in a court of law, but with a coroner's report. The news broke like a physical blow. For the survivors, it was a theft of unimaginable proportions. They had spent years steeling themselves for the moment they could face him in court, to deliver their victim impact statements, to look him in the eye as a judge handed down a sentence. That day, that catharsis was now gone forever. The man who had stolen their childhoods had, in his final act, stolen their justice. The dominant emotion was not relief, but a white-hot rage mixed with a hollow despair. He had escaped. In the end, he had still found a way to escape immediately. The official narrative began to form: suicide by hanging. But this explanation landed in a public sphere already primed for suspicion. It felt too neat, too convenient. This was not just any prisoner. This was a man whose secrets implicated some of the most powerful people on the planet. He held the keys to a kingdom of blackmail, a black book of names that could topple empires and ruin legacies. The idea that such a man would be allowed to simply take his own life, silencing himself forever, seemed not just improbable but impossible. The questions began to multiply, spawning 1,000 conspiracy theories that bloomed in the vacuum of information. Who benefited most from his silence? Was he murdered to protect the powerful? Was he spirited away in a plot of unbelievable complexity? The hashtag Epstein didn't kill himself became a viral phenomenon, a shorthand for a deep and pervasive distrust of official institutions. It was a meme, but it was also a howl of public frustration, a collective refusal to accept the simple, unsatisfying answer. The scene inside the MCC, as details began to leak out, did nothing to quell the suspicion. It painted a picture not of a sinister plot, but of a level of negligence so profound it bordered on the absurd. This was a man who had, just weeks earlier on July 23rd, been found semi-conscious in his cell with marks on his neck, an apparent first suicide attempt. He had been placed on suicide watch, a status that requires constant monitoring and psychiatric evaluation. Yet, inexplicably, he had been taken off the watch just 6 days later and returned to the special housing unit with a cellmate. More bizarrely, that cellmate had been transferred out the day before his death, leaving Epstein alone, a direct violation of the jail's own procedures. The very purpose of the special housing unit was to provide heightened security for high-profile inmates. Yet, on that fateful night, the system seemed to have collapsed entirely. The 2 guards assigned to his unit were reportedly sleeping. They had allegedly falsified logs to claim they had been making their required rounds every 30 minutes to cameras outside his cell, which might have provided a definitive answer, had mysteriously malfunctioned. Every single fail-safe, every protocol designed to prevent exactly this outcome, had failed simultaneously. It was a perfect storm of incompetence or something more. The death of Jeffrey Epstein did not provide closure. It created a black hole of doubt, dragging the entire story into a realm of permanent, haunting ambiguity, leaving his victims and the world with nothing but a deafening silence and questions that would likely never be answered. Chapter 16: Security Failures and Official Explanations. In the aftermath of the shocking death that silenced a generation's most notorious predator, the search for answers began. The official pronouncements from the Department of Justice were swift and firm. Jeffrey Epstein had died by suicide, and a thorough investigation would be launched into the serious irregularities at the Metropolitan Correctional Center that allowed it to happen. What followed was not a clear, reassuring explanation, but a slow, painful autopsy of a system in a state of catastrophic decay. The story of Epstein's final hours became a case study in bureaucratic rot, a tale of sleeping guards, falsified records, and a level of negligence so complete it strained credulity. The focus immediately fell on the 2 correctional officers assigned to Epstein's unit on the night of August 9th, Tova Noel and Michael Thomas. Their jobs were simple if tedious, to patrol the 9 cells in their unit every 30 minutes. Instead, as federal prosecutors would later allege, the 2 men sat at their desk, browsed the internet for furniture and motorcycle sales, and slept for significant portions of their shift. To cover their tracks, they allegedly signed slip after slip of paper, creating a fraudulent log that indicated they had performed dozens of rounds they never made. For 8 hours, the most important prisoner in their care was left completely unmanaged. This dereliction of duty was staggering, but it was only one piece of a much larger puzzle of institutional failure. Attorney General William Barr expressed his outrage, decrying the NCC's failure to adequately secure this prisoner. The FBI descended upon the facility, and the warden was reassigned. But the more investigators dug, the worse it looked. The jail was chronically understaffed, a problem rampant throughout the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Guards were working extreme overtime, leading to exhaustion and burnout. The facility itself was notoriously grim, with reports of vermin, leaking sewage, and inhumane conditions. It was a tinderbox of dysfunction waiting for a spark. The mystery of the 2 malfunctioning cameras outside Epstein's cell deepened the public's suspicion, while officials later clarified that footage from other cameras in the tier offered a partial view and showed no one entering or leaving the area around his cell. The initial reports of broken cameras had already cemented a narrative of a cover-up in the public mind. The official explanation that one camera's footage was unusable and another had recorded a different area was technically plausible but emotionally unsatisfying. In the context of so many other failures, it felt like another convenient excuse. The investigation by New York City's chief medical examiner, Dr. Barbara Sampson, concluded that the cause of death was suicide by hanging. However, a private pathologist hired by Epstein's brother, the famed Dr. Michael Baden, publicly disputed this finding. Baden pointed to unusual fractures in Epstein's hyoid bone and thyroid cartilage, suggesting they were more indicative of homicidal strangulation than suicidal hanging. While most forensic experts sided with the official ruling, Baden's dissent provided just enough of a counter-narrative to keep the embers of conspiracy glowing brightly. Ultimately, the 2 guards, Noel and Thomas, were charged with conspiracy, and filing false records, they became the public faces of the failure, the low-level scapegoats for a systemic breakdown. They later entered into a deferred prosecution agreement, avoiding prison time in exchange for community service and cooperation with the ongoing Inspector General investigation. But their prosecution did little to answer the larger, more haunting questions. How was Epstein taken off suicide watch so quickly after a clear attempt on his life? Why was his cellmate removed? Who made these decisions, and were they based on protocol or pressure? The official explanations, while pointing to a perfect storm of incompetence, could never fully erase the deep-seated feeling that something was profoundly wrong. The story of Jeffrey Epstein's life was a testament to how a broken system of justice can be manipulated by power and money. The story of his death became the final, damning chapter, revealing a broken system of custody, so dysfunctional and chaotic that it could not perform its most basic function. It concluded the saga not with a period, but with a permanent, unsettling ellipsis, leaving the world to wonder forever about the secrets that died with him in that unwatched cell. Chapter 17, Ghislaine Maxwell, Partner in the Shadows. To understand the darkness that radiated from Jeffrey Epstein, one cannot simply look at the man himself. One must look into the shadows that surrounded him, and in the deepest part of that shade stood Ghislaine Maxwell. She was not a mere subordinate or a girlfriend. She was the co-architect of a monstrous enterprise, the sophisticated, smiling face that made the unspeakable seem plausible, even glamorous. Her story is a chilling portrait of complicity, a tragic fall from grace, or perhaps the truest expression of a lineage steeped in manipulation and moral ambiguity. Born into a world of almost unimaginable privilege, she was the favored daughter of Robert Maxwell, the larger-than-life, tyrannical media mogul whose own empire was built on a foundation of bluster, debt, and deceit. She grew up in palaces, rode thoroughbred horses, and moved with an effortless grace through the highest echelons of British society. This was a birthright, a world of access, influence, and the unspoken belief that rules were for other people. When her father died, under mysterious circumstances in 1991, falling from his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, the world she knew collapsed. The discovery that he had plundered hundreds of millions from his company's pension funds left the family name in ruins and Ghislaine adrift. It was in this void that Jeffrey Epstein appeared, or rather re-emerged as her savior. He offered her not just financial security, but a new kingdom over which to preside. He gave her a purpose, and in return, she gave him everything. She became his emissary, his social fixer, his other half. She was the one who could open doors that even Epstein's billions could not. With her impeccable accent, her Rolodex of royals and celebrities, and her practiced charm, she laundered Epstein's sordid reputation, transforming him from a mysterious and somewhat vulgar financier into an enigmatic figure of intrigue. But her role, as prosecutors and survivors would later attest, was far more sinister than that of a high-class social secretary. Ghislaine Maxwell, they alleged, was the chief recruiter. She was the predator who hunted not with brute force, but with the disarming allure of friendship and opportunity. To a vulnerable teenage girl from a broken home, working a low-wage job in Palm Beach, Maxwell must have seemed like a creature from another planet. She would appear impeccably dressed, radiating confidence and warmth. She was a woman which made her seem safe. She spoke of mentorship, of helping them with their education, of introducing them to a world of possibility they could scarcely imagine. She would invite them to the movies, take them shopping, and become their confidant. It was a masterclass in psychological grooming. She built trust brick by brick, creating a bond that felt genuine and caring. She was the reassuring hand on the shoulder, leading them gently towards the cliff's edge. The betrayal was the sharpest part of the wound. For many of the girls, the emotional manipulation inflicted by Maxwell was as damaging as the physical abuse they would later endure from Epstein. She was the one who normalized the horror. She was often present, an overseer who lent an air of legitimacy to the sordid transactions. Her presence seemed to communicate that this was acceptable, that this was just how this rarefied world worked. She allegedly coached them on what to say, how to act, and how to please Epstein. She was the one who managed the logistics, the scheduling of the massages, the flow of young bodies through Epstein's mansions in New York, Palm Beach, New Mexico, and his private Caribbean island. She was, in essence, the human resources manager for a sexual abuse trafficking ring. Her meticulous social planning and organizational skills repurposed for the most depraved of ends. In the shadows, she was not a partner but a queen in her own right, reigning over a kingdom of stolen innocence and shattered dreams. Her loyalty to Epstein, a bond forged in secret and sealed with the silent tears of countless victims. Chapter 18. The Network Remains. Unanswered Names and Files. If Jeffrey Epstein was the spider at the center of a monstrous web, and Ghislaine Maxwell the one who diligently spun its silken, deadly threads, then the web itself remains the most terrifying and unresolved part of the entire saga. It stretches across continents, through the most exclusive social circles, and into the very pinnacles of global power, science, and finance. This was not the work of two isolated monsters. It was an operation that was sustained, protected, and enjoyed by a network so powerful that even now, its full contours remain shrouded in a fog of legal battles, sealed documents, and a chilling, coordinated silence. The story of this network is a ghost story, haunting the public record with unanswered questions and the spectral presence of names that flicker in and out of view, never fully illuminated, never truly held to account. The primary artifacts of this ghostly network are Epstein's Black Book and the flight logs from his private jet, the Lolita Express. These are not mere address books or travel itineraries, they are ledgers of complicity, catalogues of access. The Black Book, a leather-bound directory filled with over 1,000 names, is a who's who of the global elite from the late 20th and early 21st centuries. It contains princes and politicians, movie stars and moguls, Nobel laureates and titans of industry. To be in the book was to be in Epstein's orbit. While inclusion is not proof of wrongdoing, the sheer breadth of the connections paints a damning picture of the world he inhabited. Why did so many powerful people feel the need to be connected to a man whose predatory tastes were, by many accounts, an open secret? The book is a map of the access he craved and curated, the power he collected as if they were trophies. Each name is a potential witness, a potential enabler, or worse, a potential participant. And the failure to thoroughly investigate each connection represents a colossal failure of will. Even more damning are the flight logs. The Gulfstream jet was a flying clubhouse for the rich and powerful, ferrying them between Epstein's various lairs, the opulent Manhattan townhouse, the sprawling New Mexico ranch, the sun-drenched Palm Beach estate, and the horrifying private island of Little St. James. The logs read like a fantasy guest list, featuring names like Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, Kevin Spacey, and renowned scientists like Stephen Hawking. Again, a flight does not equal guilt, but the logs place these powerful men, time and again, in intimate proximity to Epstein and, crucially, in the presence of underage girls who were also listed as passengers. The logs demand answers to deeply uncomfortable questions. What did these men see? What did they know on a private jet hurtling through the sky? Secrets are hard to keep. Did they witness the unsettlingly young masses? Did they hear the whispers? Or did they choose a willful blindness, a silent pact made in exchange for the extravagant hospitality and the intoxicating proximity to Epstein's power and wealth? The network remains because the system allows it to. For years, legal teams fought to keep documents sealed, to keep names redacted, to protect the reputations of the powerful. The slow, painful unsealing of files has felt less like a pursuit of justice and more like a carefully managed release of information designed to mitigate damage rather than expose truth. The silence from the vast majority of those whose names appear in the logs and the book is deafening. They have hidden behind carefully worded statements from publicists, flat denials, or claims of a faded memory. This collective amnesia is an insult to the intelligence of the public and to the suffering of the victims. The network is not just a list of names. It is a culture of impunity. It is the unspoken agreement that what happens in Epstein's world stays in Epstein's world until every name is examined, every connection investigated, and every secret file brought into the light. The network remains a shadowy monument to the idea that, if you are powerful enough, you can build a world where even the most monstrous crimes leave no trace. Chapter 19, Accountability Denied. Why Justice Failed. Justice is meant to be a great equalizer, a blindfolded figure holding scales that weigh the deeds of the rich and the poor, the powerful and the meek, with the same impartial gravity. In the case of Jeffrey Epstein, the blindfold was ripped away, the scales were rigged, and the sword of justice was left to rust in its scabbard. The story of the legal pursuit of Epstein is not a story of justice, but a wrenching, heartbreaking chronicle of its systemic and deliberate denial. It is a tale of cowardice, corruption, and a chilling deference to power that left a trail of betrayed victims, and a gaping wound in the public's faith in the law. The failure was not a single event, but a cascade of capitulations, a death by 1,000 cuts to the very soul of the American legal system, the original sin. The moment of absolute moral collapse was the 2008 Non-Prosecution Agreement (NPA). It stands as one of the most infamous documents in modern legal history, a testament to the dark arts of backroom deal-making. At the time, federal prosecutors in Florida, led by then U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta, had amassed a mountain of evidence against Epstein. They had the testimony of dozens of young women, detailing a vast and organized sexual abuse operation. A 53-page federal indictment was drafted, ready to charge Epstein with crimes that could have sent him to prison for the rest of his life. The case was, by all accounts, a slam dunk, and then it vanished, behind closed doors without the knowledge or consent of the victims. Acosta's office negotiated a secret deal with Epstein's high-powered legal team, which included figures like Alan Dershowitz and Kenneth Starr. The terms of the NPA were breathtaking in their leniency. Epstein would plead guilty to 2 minor state-level prostitution charges, one of which involved a minor. He would serve a mere 13 months in a private wing of a county jail, with a generous work release program that allowed him to spend up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week in his downtown office. Most devastatingly, the deal granted sweeping immunity from all federal charges to Epstein and any potential co-conspirators. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card not just for him, but for his entire network. The victims who had bravely come forward were rendered invisible. Their justice was sold out from under them. Acosta would later defend the deal as the best he could get, claiming Epstein's connections were so vast that he belonged to intelligence and was above his pay grade. This excuse is more damning than the deal. Itself an admission that within the U.S. Department of Justice, there exists a class of persons so powerful they are simply untouchable. This denial of accountability festered for over a decade. It was only the relentless, courageous work of journalist Julie K. Brown of the Miami Herald that dragged the case back into the light. Her reporting, which centered the voices of the victims who had been silenced and betrayed, shamed the system into action. In 2019, federal prosecutors in New York, a different jurisdiction, finally brought new charges against Epstein for sex trafficking. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that accountability was finally within reach. The world watched, waiting for the trial that would expose the full extent of his crimes and his network. But justice was denied once more. On August 10, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his jail cell, an apparent suicide that immediately sparked a firestorm of doubt and conspiracy theories. The one man who held all the secrets, the key that could unlock the entire conspiracy, was gone. His death was the final, cruel punchline to a tragic joke, ensuring that the primary target of the law would never face a jury, and his many powerful associates could breathe a collective sigh of relief. Accountability was not just denied, it was permanently, irrevocably checkmated. Chapter 20, Lessons Unlearned, Power, Abuse, and the System. The death of Jeffrey Epstein and the conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell should have been moments of catharsis, the closing of a dark and sordid chapter. They should have served as a stark warning to the powerful and a solemn promise to the vulnerable that the system, however flawed, would ultimately bend towards justice. Instead, the aftermath of the Epstein saga feels like a disquieting silence, the kind that follows a massive explosion when no one is yet sure of the full extent of the damage. The lessons that should have been seared into our collective conscience seem to have been written in disappearing ink. We are left with the haunting suspicion that Jeffrey Epstein was not a uniquely monstrous aberration, but rather a grotesque symptom of a chronic and deeply rooted societal sickness, a sickness that we have failed to diagnose, let alone cure. The first and most glaring lesson we have failed to learn is about the corrosive nature of extreme wealth. Epstein's money was not just a tool for a lavish lifestyle. It was a weapon and a shield. He used it to buy silence, to purchase loyalty, and to fund a phalanx of the most formidable lawyers on the planet, who could bludgeon the justice system into submission. He used philanthropy as a form of reputation laundering, donating to esteemed institutions like Harvard and MIT, thereby wrapping himself in the prestige of science and academia. This created a powerful disincentive for anyone to look too closely at the source of his wealth or the nature of his private life. The system, from law enforcement to academia, became addicted to his largesse. This demonstrates a terrifying truth. Our most revered institutions are susceptible to being compromised by dark money. We have not yet had a serious public reckoning with how to insulate our systems of justice, science, and education from the influence of predatory philanthropists. Secondly, the case exposed the profound and enduring misogyny that still riddles our culture and legal system. For years, the victims were not seen as credible. They were dismissed as troubled young women, as gold diggers, as willing participants. Their youth and socioeconomic status were used against them, their trauma discounted. It took the unwavering courage of the survivors themselves, and the dogged reporting of a female journalist to force the world to listen. The system is still not built to hear the voices of young women, especially those without social power. We pay lip service to believing victims, but when those victims accuse a man of immense power and influence, the institutional instinct is still to protect the man and question the victim, until we fundamentally rewire our societal and legal frameworks to center the experience of the abused over the reputation of the abuser. Another Epstein is not just possible, but probable. Finally, we have failed to grapple with the allure of access and the complicity of the elite. The names in Epstein's black book and on his flight logs were not just his friends. They were part of the ecosystem that enabled him, by associating with him, by attending his parties and flying on his jet. They lent him their credibility. They created a social force field around him that made him seem untouchable. Each celebrity photo op, each handshake with a politician, each academic conference he sponsored, strengthened his shield. The desperate, pathetic desire to be close to power and wealth created a collective blindness among people. Who should have known better? There has been no mass shunning of those who enabled Epstein. For the most part, they have been allowed to melt back into the social firmament. Their association with a convicted paedophile a mere footnote to their otherwise celebrated lives. This is the most chilling unlearned lesson of all, that in the calculus of the elite, proximity to power is worth more than moral integrity, and the suffering of the powerless is a price they are all too willing to let others pay.